Greetings, everyone. This is Ehab Ever, and I'm going to be doing a kind of somewhat semi-quick video about what exactly is a Masoretic text. So this question came out of another discussion I've been involved in a particular forum, and it basically concerns someone who was of a particular, I guess, religious, I don't know, organization, I'll call it, if you will, that has very particular beliefs on something. And one of the claims that they were trying to make was that the Jewish people who exist right now don't have a knowledge of ancient Hebrew or as well as the ancient Jewish text of the Torah. I think their claim was trying to revolve around claiming that the only thing that Jews have today is called a Masoretic text, and that text somehow is not reliable or it's not ancient. And I got the impression that they had no idea really what they were even talking about when they mentioned what a Masoretic text is. And hopefully in this video I can break it down a little bit. Okay, so in order to understand what exactly is a Masoretic text versus something that's not a Masoretic text, you have to kind of first answer the question of what exactly is a Jewish text of the Torah? What text exists in the Jewish community? So generally speaking, there are two categories of text. The first one, you've heard me talk about this in other videos, but I'm going to be more specific, and that's what I would call in English an official Torah scroll or a Sefer Torah. So what are the ramifications of a Sefer Torah? Sefer Torah, first of all, only includes the 5 books of Moses. It's a requirement. I've mentioned this in other videos that there is a requirement on who's allowed to write an official Torah scroll. It usually takes about a year to copy it because you can't, like, for example, sit down and do it by memory. A person who does it, for example, for it to be used in an official public setting like a synagogue, has to sit there basically for a year. And during the time that they're working on it, they have to do a lot of preparation work, which includes, for example, like writing certain letters, not in the scroll itself, but like separate from the scroll, and then preparing themselves mentally. And they have to be someone who keeps the Torah. So, for example, let's say you have someone who doesn't keep Shabbat or doesn't keep the Sabbath, as they say in English. That person cannot write a Torah scroll that's acceptable to a Torah Moshe synagogue, for example. Let's say that there's someone who doesn't keep kosher. They don't eat kosher food, can't accept their Torah scroll. They can write a Torah scroll for themselves. They can write it for personal use, but they can't write one to be used in an official setting in a synagogue and to be read from in a synagogue. So you first would have to know who exactly this person is who's transcribing it. The other thing too, as I mentioned before, it's being transcribed. It's not being written by memory. So it's not like anything you see in this particular picture of a Torah scroll was written by somebody sitting down and just kind of going by memory what's in the text. They have to use an already existing Torah scroll that has been proven to be correct and accurate because it was copied from a Torah scroll itself, or, a previous version. And that Torah scroll, for example, when the person's transcribing it, he has to go back and forth between, like looking what's there and copying exactly. And then even after he's done, that particular text has to be checked several times. And even after that's done, when it goes into circulation in a synagogue, it's read from essentially, if let's say a synagogue only had one Torah scroll that looks like this, they would essentially be reading it pretty much like on Saturdays, if you will, from the English perspective. On the Shabbat, they would be reading it on Mondays, and also they'd be reading it on Thursdays. So essentially, they'd be going through this Torah scroll every year, and then rewinding it all the way back to the beginning and going back over it every single year. So at some point, if there were mistakes in it, because people are sitting there with their own books, and also their other Torah scrolls to compare it to, mistakes are found, and whenever a mistake is found, the Torah scroll has to be brought out of circulation, repaired if it can be, and then it can be brought back into circulation, but it can't be used until it's prepared. So that's the first category. An official Torah scroll is something that only includes the 5 books of Moses, because that's the official baseline text of all Jewish communities. It's like the groundwork of everything we do as Jews and everything we hold by as Jews. And then from there, those Torah scrolls are copied from other Torah scrolls that have been proven to be reliable. So getting to that point, I've talked about this in other videos. The way the whole thing started was Moshe Rabbeinu, also in English known as Moses, was given the exact information to put into the Torah scroll by the creator of all things, by Hashem. And essentially, all modern day Torah scrolls can be shown to trace back from Torah scrolls that at least go back about 2,500 years. And that's including if you were to take the Dead Sea Scrolls and compare it, because the Dead Sea Scrolls and modern day Torah scrolls are not that different. The main difference, as we'll explain later, is that the Dead Sea Scrolls are not official Torah scrolls. They are simply what later we'll talk about being Chumashim. So this picture you see on the right is actually a picture of a 200-year Torah scroll that's in my community, in the synagogue I'm a part of here in Jerusalem. Um, and it was brought from Yemen. And essentially, it's like the oldest Torah scroll we have in our community, but it was copied from a Torah scroll that was several hundred years older than it. So that means about 200 years ago, the Sofer from the Sharabi family, who transcribed this Torah scroll that you see on the right side of this picture, he had copied it from a Torah scroll that was several hundred years old at the time. So that means that that Torah scroll would have been about 500, 600 years old. And there's people here. There's actually a family who came from Yemen not too long ago, came to Israel, who brought a Torah scroll with them that was about 800 years old. So you have a number of communities, not just in the Yemenite community, but also other Jewish communities that have Torah scrolls in some cases in their communities in their possession that are like several hundred years old. And if you compared all of them, especially when you say, okay, well, this Torah scroll came from this location and this from that location, you'll find that they are basically the same thing. So this is something that I've shown in, I think I've shown this in a few other videos I've had. I know of some of the papers I've written on the Torah scroll, I've shown this. But as I was saying earlier, if you were to take Torah scrolls from different locations, like for example, Italian Torah scrolls, Iraqi Torah scrolls, Yemenite Torah scrolls, and Spanish Torah scrolls, and Chinese Torah scrolls, and even if you just for laughs took a Samaritan Torah scroll and put it on the side, what you would find with all Jewish Torah scrolls from ancient Jewish communities, you would find that they are basically the same Torah scroll. That the differences are not major differences. There's only about like 14, and you're talking about like Torah scrolls contain about, I think it's like over 300,000 words. And out of all those 300,000 words, there's only like about 14 differences between those Torah scrolls. And most of them agree. For example, Iraqi and Yemenite Torah scrolls are the same, as well as most Spanish Torah scrolls are the same. You may find a difference amongst certain Northern European ones, but the differences usually are something to the level of the size of a letter. There's a specific part of a Torah scroll that either has a letter that's big in one area, one particular letter of a word, of this one particular word, or it's regular sized in other Torah scrolls. And then there's only like two differences that are like word differences, and even then, one of them uses like a word that's more extreme than the other one, but they mean basically the same thing. And the other difference you could say is one has a particular name or title that's separated by a space. The other one doesn't have the space. And that's what you're looking at. So you're talking about it for about 2,500 years, you find that Jewish Torah scrolls are the same. And if you took the Samaritan Torah scroll, which the Samaritans are kind of a completely different group of people, but they have a Torah of their own. Their Torah has about 6,000 differences between us and them, but there's only about 1,000 Samaritans left in the world anyway. And even those differences are not like differences where you would think that would happen between a group who kind of broke away. You would think that they would change the whole structure of the text, but those differences are like choices in words and things like that. Okay, so now looking at this very simply, what we can do is this is essentially when a person is looking inside of a Torah scroll, one that's found inside of a wooden case called a teak, or sometimes there's cases that are made of silver or different types of materials, depends on how much money somebody wants to spend on the case for the Torah scroll. If a person were to take out a Torah scroll, this is the kind of thing that they would see, first approaching it. Now, as a person gets, as we get closer and take a look at the text itself, going up. So, for example, this text here is from the Song by the Sea, or the Ashira, say it in Hebrew. So, for example, if we were to start, someone reading this could easily know and say that if they were, reading it and then, understanding where exactly to pronounce things a certain way, as well as to stop in places that like denote certain levels of punctuation. Someone reading this would know this says, ويوشع أدوني بيوم هو أتيسرى ميات مصرايم ويرسرى أت مصرايم ميت على صفاتيهم ويرسرى أتيود جدول وشرع صادونون بمصرايم ويروهم نتادوني ويامنوا بعضوني مشى عبدهم وزن شمر شايفني سرى تشير هزت لأذوني ويامروا لمر أشير لأذوني كراجع سسر خبر رمضيم وزمرت يوم وهلي ليشوع زائلي وأنواه ألويه في وأرمناه أذنوي إشمل حمو أذنوي شمو مركب بعرو وحلو يرفيم وابن فرشو لشوب تبعو ذي يمسوف تهمث يخسيورم يورث ذم سلات كما أوفان ימינך אדוני נדורי בכוח, ימינך אדוני תרצייב, ובנג'ונך תהרוס קמך, תשלח חרונך, יאכלמו גגש, וברוק אפך, נערמו מים, ניסבוך מונד נוזלים, כבותהם בלב יום, אומר יב ארדבסיך, אכלך שלום, תמלואמו נפשי, אורך הרבי, תורישמו יודי, נשבתו ברוח קצום יום, צוללו כעופרת במים אדירים, מחומוך בו אלים, אדוני מקומוך נדר בגודש, נורותי לו על שפלם, נוטיתו ימינך, תמלואמו אורץ, נוחית ובחסתכו, אמזוג'אותו, נהלתו ועזכו, הנבואת קודשך, שמוע עממים ירג'זון, חילוך הזיו שווה פלושת, אוזנבלו אלופי אדום, אלה מוב יו חזמו רעד נמוהו, כל יושבך נוען, תיפל עליהם אמותו, ופחת, בכבוד זרוע אחד ידמקו אובן, עד יעבור עמכו אדוני, עד יעבור עמזוגו ניתו, תביאמו ותטעמו, בהרנה הלובתכם, מכון לשבתכו פעלתו, אדוני מגדוש, אדוני קומנו יתכם, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, כיבוס ספרו ברכבו ופורשו ביום, ויושב אדוני עליהם את 100 יום, ובני ישראל לא תחויבו בו שבתוך היום. So, essentially that's how somebody would be able to read a Torah scroll. And notice that I'm reading it, as we'll see later, without any form of punctuation, without any form of vowels being marked, but just simply that I've, when I was taught how to read, I was taught to read in a specific way, and also we read this by essentially every morning when we pray our morning prayers, like called Shachrit. We actually repeat this every day, even not from a Torah scroll every day, but essentially what we do is if we read it enough and understand the language, you can easily read something like this and know what is supposed to be there in terms of vowels and punctuation without it being there. And I'm reading this just in the way it's done during the prayers, like the shacharit prayers, and not exactly the way it would be done like if I was to be in front of a group of people in a synagogue reading it publicly. Now the second category is what you would generally speaking call a Masoretic text, or in some cases you might just say it's a Masoretic type text, and I'll explain why that is. You could also call it a Chumash. Now, one of the mistakes that some people make is they might say, okay, well, that means does it mean that a Masoretic text is a text that's bound like a book rather than a scroll? No, that's actually not true. The reality is, as a Masoretic text, essentially what the Masorites did was what they lived in a time where they saw that there was a need to take the system that I showed you earlier of the Torah scroll that had no vowel markings and had no punctuation markings, and create a system based on the oral system that had already previously been in place of putting in those marks so that people would be able to read it. And there's two general scripts, which I won't be covering in this video, but maybe I'll do another one later on to kind of separate it out, that were used. And the one that's mainly used today in modern Hebrew comes from a place called Tiberia in the north. There was another system used in Babylon, which is the Bavli system. And basically the pronunciation has some minor differences between the two, like a dialect difference. But generally speaking, they're the same. Yemenite Jews at one point used to use exclusively the Babylonian system in many areas, but the Tivaria system also exists. But when we get, if one day I'll do a video about Yemenite pronunciation or something, we'll talk more about that. But what's important to note here is even though I'm showing you a book form, which of a Masoretic text, meaning where they added vowels, they added notes, they added punctuation. Essentially, what we're talking about here is that a Masoretic text could have been on a scroll, but again, they would have just added into that scroll the punctuation. And it's important to note that a Masoretic text would never be used in an official setting in a synagogue. So, for example, you would never publicly read at a synagogue setting, in an official setting, from a Masoretic text or a Chumash in order to, like, say, you fulfill the mitzvah of learning from the Torah in the synagogue. That's something that nobody would do. Only the Torah scrolls that I showed earlier are the ones that are valid for that purpose, for example. So if we do a comparison between what exactly is the difference between a Sefer Torah, one that's an official text used in a synagogue, and one that's a Masoretic text or a Chumash, the easiest way to kind of delineate the difference would be that the Torah scroll is like I said before, an official text, like I said before, it takes about a year to transcribe one because it has to be done exactly perfectly right. And any mistakes in it basically invalidates it or it can't be used. And essentially, usually speaking, it usually will cost about $40,000 to $50,000, depending on the type of scroll, to produce such a text. So you're looking at someone's like salary for the, for example, for the year, because the person's spending a year doing it. Where a Humash or a Masoretic text, like you see on the right side, like either in a book form or is in an unofficial scroll form, I could sit down and write one of those myself if I wanted to, if I had the time. And essentially, that text would serve my personal purposes, but I couldn't sit there in front of a community and read it. And that's where people like sometimes get mixed up, where the differences and often found in the text that people like you look at are usually Masoretic text where someone wrote their own personal version of it, but it's not used officially, which is perfectly fine. I mean, someone doesn't have time to sit there and wait for a year and pay someone $40,000 to make a Torah scroll. Of course, needs the Torah because we have to learn the Torah. So nowadays, with the printing technology being what it is, you find fewer variances between Masoretic texts, but even the ones that did exist even before that point were usually very minor and nothing that changed the meaning of the text or made you think, oh, this someone else must have written this. This is not a Jewish text. Mostly, you're talking about something where someone may have punctuated it incorrectly, where they had the right information, the right information from the Torah scroll itself, but they may have had the wrong punctuation. We'll see how that works out pretty soon. So let's take a look here and see what the difference would be between a Torah scroll and a Sefer Torah and a Masoretic text. So on the top part of this page, the part that you see with the yellow arrow above it, that comes from essentially from a Torah scroll. That's the first part of the Torah scroll in Genesis 1, for example, called Bereshith. And essentially, well, of course, like I mentioned in previous videos, we read Hebrew from right to left. So essentially, this would be reading Bereshit boro Elohim et hashamayim v'et ha'oretz. Okay, so that's based upon just reading it as it is, and of course, this is something that's learned. We learn to read it and understand what the language is and what the pronunciation is. So if we were reading it officially in a Torah sense, you'd be Bereshit boro Elohim et hashamayim v'et ha'oretz. That's that first line. So if we go down to the bottom and say, okay, what's the corresponding text? The bottom one is a Masoretic text with the vowels added. So if you look at it side, we can't exactly look at it side by side because again, a Torah scroll is usually bigger than a Masoretic text in a book form, for example, because of the fact that Torah is, has got more honor to it, But essentially, if we go down to the Masoretic text and read from it, you'll see that it has the same information. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim, and then also it continues on the next line. So as you can see, it's the exact same information, the exact same pronunciation, the difference being that the one on the bottom, there have been markings added to it. So you look on the bottom, you see different little markings, those are the vowels. This particular text also has under it some of what's called ta'amim in Hebrew, which is the punctuation. So for example, meaning that in ancient Hebrew, there was no commas, periods, and stuff like that. You just have to understand when you read the text where they are. This is something that was taught orally. And essentially, all old Torah scrolls are like the one above on the top, including the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, did not have punctuation in them. So the only way a person would have known how to read them, and even, in fact, even today, the only way anybody knows how to read them is because of the Masoretic text. If it wasn't for the Masoretic text, the only people who would know how to read Jewish text would be Jews who learn from other Jews. You may have a few people who are not Jewish who may come in and learn it somehow, but for the most part, most non-Jews would not know how to read the Torah or any of the biblical books, or the Tanakh books, I should say. Biblical being, the English perception of the text. Nobody would be able to read it. So basically, all of Christianity wouldn't be able to read it if it wasn't for Jews who had preserved it, including any scholars that are out there. They would have had to have learned it from Jews who knew it orally and would have passed it down orally. So just to kind of give you a deeper understanding, this same Masoretic text we were looking at earlier, and again, Masoretic text just simply means that someone who was a Masorite the Masorites created the system of the vowel points and the system of the tamim based upon what had already existed orally. So they simply said, okay, well, if I'm saying Bereshith already, I need to come up with vowel markings that denote the e, o, and for example, the I think we already said o. So basically, those vowels that you hear, like for example, when you hear Bereshith, e, be for the be, re, sheath. So that e, that would have already been known based upon just an understanding of the reading. So they created vowel marks for each of those sounds. And then they created ta'amim marks. So when I'm reading this, Bereshit Boro Elohim, so you see I stopped right there. That's because there's a punctuation there called atnoho, and that tells me that's kind of like almost like a semicolon in English. So essentially breaking this down in the picture, what we see surrounded in the yellow square is the Masoretic vowel marks. What you see in the blue are Masoretic punctuation marks. And, as we mentioned, punctuation being almost like if you had commas, periods, things like that. And then in the red, you see like the notes that were added, notes about like the punctuation, notes about the pronunciation, notes about anything that the particular Masorite was like thinking about the text, or anybody who came along later and transcribed from another like text. And usually speaking, most Jews would want to try to transcribe from older text, meaning that if I want the most accurate picture of what to transcribe, I would need to go to the oldest text I can find. So an example of what we've gone over for people who speak English and who, for some of them, that may be real confusing what we're saying. Imagine that 300 years ago, English was a consonant-only language with no vowel markings and no vowel letters, for example, and no punctuation marks, and that everybody just simply learned English and understood how to read based on consonants alone. So, for example, imagine that this statement you see in bold is an English statement from 300 years ago. And I were to read it, most people look and say, okay, I maybe understand where you're coming from some of that, because English is a consonant and a vowel language at this point, purely both. Most people look at this and say, I have no idea what's written here. So for example, I could tell you, say, oh, what's written here is thus, he told me to walk down the street and pick up the paper. And basically what it means is that if we were to apply the Masoretic idea to what we've mentioned earlier, the Masoretic innovation here would be that they added vowel letters, or you could say vowel markings, as well as punctuation marks, which is marked in red. So all the areas that were missing in the previous part, it was like, let's just say our example of 300 years ago, are added in for the modern reader who may not understand how English from 300 years ago would have worked. And again, this is not how English worked 300 years ago. This is just me giving an example. So essentially, again, the innovation is the letters or markings to denote an already existing vowel and punctuation system. And that means that the system of vowels and punctuation was already there, because otherwise nobody would be able to read and understand something. But essentially it was known enough to people to where they could read a text without the vowels and without the punctuation and understand it just simply because they were trained how to do so. And that's why, for example, in modern Israel, newspapers and books are predominantly written without vowels, because the Jewish population after the Masoretic innovation were able to, the areas of the Jewish populations that didn't understand Hebrew as good, were able to kind of bring themselves up. And now you have a situation where in the modern state, now that Hebrew is a national language again, you have a situation where people can read without vowels. Punctuation is used in modern Hebrew in newspapers and books, but generally speaking, people can read it without the vowels. And that's something that's taught from the early age, and so on and so on. So essentially, that's how we would explain this in a modern instance, so that people who don't know can understand what we're even talking about. So in conclusion, essentially you've seen what exactly a Masoretic text is, because one of the things I find is that when people who don't know Hebrew start investigating this issue, many of the articles written on this topic can't really give you a full picture of what it is that we're looking at when you don't understand the language and you don't see what we're seeing there. And often some of these articles are written by people who don't keep Torah and have a particular viewpoint that they're looking at there being something incorrect about what Jews are doing, which is fine. I mean, it doesn't really matter. Someone can come with that conclusion, but often you don't find people showing you exactly what they're talking about. So when they say, well, the Masoretic text, most English speakers who've never read Hebrew have no idea what they really mean when they say Masoretic text. Where I just showed you that, for example, that there are Torah scroll texts that are not Masoretic texts simply because they don't have vowel points and they don't have the punctuation. But the minute you add the punctuation, that's a Masoretic text, because that's what the Masorites created. All they created was a vowel system and a punctuation system to denote what had already been there orally before they created it. So Dead Sea Scrolls, the only way that anybody in the Dead Sea could have read the Dead Sea Scrolls is if they already orally knew, because there were no vowel points back then. So that's one of the things that people have to be clear about. And at some point I may do a video about the Dead Sea Scrolls, because often I meet people who think that the Dead Sea Scrolls are so much different. And if you compare Torah text, like the actual 5 books of Moses, you don't find really any differences. So again, this is a Hav Ever from the Chronicles of a Hav Ever, and this is another short video somewhat. I mean, almost 20 minutes. I'm getting pretty good at this now, as I used to do it when I only had the ability to do 10 minutes. So appreciate you listening, and I hope that helps out. And if you have any question, you can leave a comment. So take care. Bye-bye.